Hi, welcome back to anatomy classes. This is Dr. Rajitha and we shall continue with the white matter of brain. In previous session we learnt about association fibers and commissural fibers of white matter of brain, and today we shall learn about the projection fibers of white matter. Projection fibers connect the cortex, that is the cerebral cortex, to different parts of subcortical regions, brainstem and spinal cord. So projection fibers are of two types, that is the ascending tracts and descending tracts. The descendings are the efferent tracts which move away from the cerebral cortex. They are called as corticofugal fibers. And ascending tracts which move towards the cerebral cortex, the impulses travel towards the cerebral cortex. These tracts are called as corticopedal fibers. So we shall begin with the types of projection fibers which are present. The projection fibers of the neocortex are of two. One is the internal capsule, which we are going to study in detail today, and the internal capsule continues cranially to form a corona radiata which fans out to the different parts of the cerebral cortex. And the projection fibers of the allocortex. Allocortex means the archicortical part and paleocortex, and these projection fibers are fimbria and fornix. So we shall deal with the internal capsule today. Internal capsule are the projection fibers of the neocortex which continue further as the corona radiata. And internal capsule in horizontal section, to see the internal capsule, it is like a thick white matter which is like a gateway, or compact fibers of white matter which travel between the thalamus and caudate nucleus on the medial side, and lateral side is the lentiform nucleus. It is like a letter V in horizontal section of the base of the brain. We can see the internal capsule as a letter V, where the concavity is towards the lentiform nucleus and convexity is facing medially towards the caudate nucleus and thalamus. Because of its shape, we can divide the internal capsule into 5 parts: anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, retrolentiform part and sublentiform parts. So first we will anterior limb is present between the head of the caudate nucleus and the anterior part of lentiform nucleus. This is the lentiform nucleus, which is a part of basal ganglia. The medial part of the lentiform nucleus is called as globus pallidus, and lateral part of it is called as the putamen. And posterior limb is present between the thalamus. Medially it is related to the thalamus, and laterally it is related to the posterior part of lentiform nucleus. And the turn between the anterior and the posterior limb, the turn is called as the genu. And posterior limb continues to form down the retrolentiform part. Retro means behind. So the part behind the lentiform nucleus down is called as the retrolentiform part. Sublentiform part is a part of internal capsule which runs below the lentiform nucleus. It is called as sublentiform part, mainly connects to the temporal lobe. So these are the parts of internal capsule. So next we shall see the fibers present in the internal capsule. There are ascending tracts, descending tracts, and there are descending tracts are again of two types: pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. Starting with the ascending tracts are the sensory tracts, and sensory tracts, all the ascending tracts, they relay in the thalamus, which is a part of diencephalon. Thalamus is the gateway for the ascending tracts. So here is the thalamus where all the sensory tracts or ascending tracts relay here. And third order neuron begins in the thalamus and they relay in different parts of cerebral cortex. So the fibers from the thalamus to different parts of cerebral cortex are divided into 4 sets of fibers: superior thalamic radiation, inferior thalamic radiation, anterior thalamic radiation and posterior thalamic radiation. Superior internal capsule anterior thalamic radiations are present. So anterior thalamic fibers are present in the anterior part. And superior thalamic radiation, that is from the thalamus to the cortex. So thalamocortical fibers or superior thalamic radiations are present in the genu and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Posterior thalamic radiation is present in the retrolentiform part. Posterior thalamic radiation is present in the retrolentiform part. It is mainly concerned with optic radiation, so it relays in the visual cortex. So next we shall see about the inferior thalamic radiation. Inferior thalamic radiation from the medial geniculate body of the thalamus, they travels towards the primary auditory area of the temporal lobe. This is the inferior thalamic radiation, which forms the part of sublentiform part of internal capsule. Let's see the other fibers present in the sublentiform part. From the thalamus to the temporal lobe, the fibers are present. They are called as thalamotemporal fibers, and from the temporal lobe to the thalamus, the fibers are called as temporothalamic fibers, and from the temporal lobe down towards the pons, the fibers are called as temporopontine fibers. So all these fibers together forms the sublentiform part present below the lentiform nucleus of internal capsule. So let's see about the descending fibers. The descending fibers of internal capsule are again classified as, they are motor fibers, and they are again classified into pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts. So we shall begin with the pyramidal tracts. Pyramidal tracts are again of two types, corticonuclear fibers and corticospinal fibers. Corticonuclear fibers, they are present in the genu of the internal capsule, and they run and relay in the brain stem. So they relay in the medulla of the brain stem. All the cranial nerve nuclei, motor nuclei of cranial nerve nuclei, they all relay, and they mainly supply the muscles of head and neck. Next we shall see about the corticospinal fibers. Corticospinal fibers are the descending tracts going down towards the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and they are again divided into three sets. The fibers which are going to the upper limb are present in the anterior part of the posterior limb. Then the muscles supplied by the trunk are present in the middle, and the lower part here in the posterior part of the posterior limb consists of the fibers supplying the legs and the lower limb. So upper limb, trunk and lower limb. So these fibers descend down towards the anterior horn of the spinal cord. They are called as corticospinal fibers. There are connections between the cortex and subcortical regions, like red nucleus of midbrain, which is called as corticorubral fibers, and the connection between the cerebral cortex to the corpus striatum is called as corticostriate fibers, and connections between the cortex to the substantia nigra is called as corticonigral fibers. So these are extrapyramidal fibers. Corticorubral, corticonigral and corticostriate, all these fibers are extrapyramidal fibers which descend down towards the brain stem, that is mainly to the midbrain of the brain stem. So these are about the descending tracts, and there are other descending tracts which run towards the pons. They are called as pontine fibers, corticopontine fibers, and these corticopontine fibers arise from the various parts of the cerebral cortex. So the fibers which are arising from the frontal lobe, they are called frontopontine. From temporal lobe, the fibers which are arising, they are called temporopontine, then paritopontine and occipitopontine. So we shall see these descending fibers now. The frontopontine fibers, which occupy the most of the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Actually the frontopontine fibers makes 2/3 of all the fibers of the internal capsule. So it is that huge, and frontopontine fibers connects the frontal lobe down to the pontine nuclei present in the pons, and further from the pontine nuclei the fibers arise and travel in the middle cerebellar peduncle to reach the cerebellum. And the next is the temporopontine fibers and peritopon. So for temporopontine fibers are present in the sublentiform part from the temporal lobe to the pons. These are called temporopontine fibers. Peritoppontine fibers and occipitopontine fibers occupy the retrolentiform part. So the retrolentiform part is occupied by peritoppontine and occipitopontine fibers. So these pontine fibers are more numerous in humans because they are more evolved and they form the major part of the internal capsule. Now we shall sum up all the tracts present in the internal capsule, and we shall begin with the ascending tracts. And ascending tracts are present in the form of thalamic radiation, which arise from the thalamus from various nucleus of thalamus, and the third order neuron of sensory tracts will relay in the different parts of cerebral cortex. So we shall begin with the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Anterior thalamic radiation is present in the anterior limb of the internal capsule, and superior thalamic radiation is present in the genu and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And retrolentiform part consists of posterior thalamic radiation. And inferior thalamic radiation arises from the medial geniculate body and forms the sublentiform part and relays in the auditory area of the cortex. And retrolentiform part, which consists of posterior thalamic radiation, they arise from the lateral geniculate body, forms the retrolentiform part, and then they move towards the visual area of the occipital lobe, forming optic radiation. So this is about the ascending tracts, and let's begin with the descending tracts. And descending tracts are corticonuclear and corticospinal, which are all pyramidal tracts. And corticonuclear tracts are present in the genu, and these tracts descend down and relay in the various motor nuclei of cranial nerves. So cranial nerve nuclei which are present in the medulla, these corticonuclear fibers relay there. And next about the corticospinal fibers. Corticospinal tracts, they are in three separate sections which supply the upper limb, trunk and the lower limb. And these tracts descend down towards the anterior horn of the spinal cord and relays in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. And lower motor neuron begins in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, which supply the various muscles in the body. Let's see about the extrapyramidal tracts. Extrapyramidal tracts are present in the posterior limb of the internal capsule along with the corticospinal tracts. Here we have shown cortico-rubral tracts, which is the extrapyramidal tract, and it runs from the cortex to the red nucleus of the midbrain. And the fibers from the cortex to the substantia nigra are called as corticonigral tract. And from the cortex to the corpus striatum, they are called corticostriate tract or corticostriate fibers. We have to see about the descending tracts which goes towards the pons. They are called as corticopontine fibers. Corticopontine fibers which are arise from the various parts of the cortex like frontal lobe called as frontopontine, occipitopontine, temporopontine, peritoppontine fibers. So frontopontine occupies the anterior limb of the internal capsule which descend down towards the pontine nuclei, and frontopontine makes the 2/3 of the fibers. And next is the peritoppontine. Peritoppontine and occipitopontine occupies in the retrolentiform part. And temporopontine is present in the sublentiform part where they arise from the temporal cortex and descend down into the pons, which is a component present in the sublentiform part. So these are about the pontine tracts, and once they relay in the pontine nuclei and pontocerebellar tracts arise from them, and where they move towards the opposite side of the cerebellum in the middle cerebellar peduncle and to relay in the cerebellar cortex. And from these corticopontine fibers are more evolved in humans, so that is the reason they occupy the most of the internal capsule. The internal capsule is compactly arranged with several ascending and descending tracts. So even if there is a small lesion, it may cause a huge difference, like opposite side of the body may get paralyzed, and there will be a loss of opposite side of sensory loss in the body if there is any disturbance in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So to understand the internal capsule, it is very critical to know the arterial supply of the internal capsule, that is the blood supply of the internal capsule. We shall begin with the basilar artery. Basilar artery is present in the basilar groove of pons, and which is formed by the fusion of right and left vertebral arteries. And basilar artery terminally divides into posterior cerebral arteries. This is the right and left posterior cerebral arteries. And here is the internal carotid artery, which is a branch of common carotid artery, and it enters into the cranial cavity through carotid canal. And internal carotid artery gives out two major branches. One is the anterior cerebral artery, the other is the middle cerebral artery. Internal carotid artery also communicates with this posterior cerebral artery by means of posterior communicating arteries. Now let's see the branches which supply the internal capsule. To understand the blood supply of the internal capsule, we have drawn in a schematic picture dividing into anterior limb, geno, posterior limb, sublentiform part and retrolentiform part. So we shall begin with the branches from the anterior cerebral artery. Anterior cerebral artery, the branch which supplies the anterior limb as well as the geno, is the recurrent artery of Hubner. And from the middle cerebral artery, there are branches called as medial and lateral striate branches. These lenticulostriate arteries will supply the posterior limb of the internal capsule. One of the lateral striate artery is usually very long and often prone for rupture, which is called as Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage, and which is a branch of middle cerebral artery. And the lateral branches of middle cerebral artery is called as Charcot's arteries of cerebral hemorrhage, and which supply the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So any block or any rupture of this artery, the posterior limb will get affected, and the lesion may result in the contralateral paralysis of the body and also the loss of sensory loss on the opposite half of the body. Next we shall see the branches from the internal carotid direct branches. The direct branches of the internal carotid artery supplies the geno, and a branch from the internal carotid artery which is called as anterior choroidal artery, which forms the choroid plexus in the ventricles, and this anterior choroidal artery gives rise to a branch which supply the sublentiform part. And the lateral branches of the posterior cerebral arteries and also the direct branch from the posterior communicating artery supply the retrolentiform part. We shall understand the internal capsule by some cut sections. This is the transverse section of cerebrum at the level of thalamus, and we can see the caudate nucleus, thalamus, and laterally this triangular part is the lentiform nucleus, and this V-like white band is the internal capsule. And internal capsule further extending to form corona radiata, that is the white matter in the cerebral cortex. And below the internal capsule, here it is continuing as retrolentiform part, which continues into the occipital lobe towards the visual cortex, forming the optic radiation, and towards the temporal lobe is the sublentiform part, which goes below the lentiform nucleus. Anterior limb, geno, posterior limb, retrolentiform part and sublentiform parts. These are the parts of internal capsule. And we can appreciate the forceps minor crossing the geno and forceps major crossing the splenium of corpus callosum. And cavities of lateral ventricle is seen. Here is the anterior horn of lateral ventricle, posterior horn of lateral ventricle. and periphery of the cerebral cortex is formed by the grey matter, and central core, the white matter is seen. The coronal section of the brain, here is the coronal section is taken just behind the temporal pole, and the cavities are the lateral ventricles, and the roof of the lateral ventricle is formed by the corpus callosum here, and this is the median longitudinal fissure separating the two cerebral hemispheres, and columns of fornix are seen separating the lateral ventricles. And in coronal section, this is the lentiform nucleus. The lateral part of it is the putamen, and the medial part of it is globus pallidus. This is the medial, and this is the lateral part of lentiform nucleus. And here is the head of the caudate nucleus. In between, we can see the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule in coronal section, which continues to form corona radiata cranially. This is a dissected specimen to show the internal capsule in sagittal section, where the lentiform nucleus is completely removed to show the parts of the internal capsule. One here is the sublentiform part, 2 is the retrolentiform part, and 3 is the posterior limb of the internal capsule, 4 is the genu of the internal capsule, and 5 is the anterior limb of the internal capsule. And we can see here the fibers further radiating in all directions towards the cerebral cortex, forming corona radiata. This is a normal MRI which is taken at the level of internal capsule. And to identify the internal capsule, first we shall locate the caudate nucleus. The 3 is the head of the caudate nucleus, and 8 is here is the thalamus, and laterally the 5 is the lentiform nucleus. And this, like letter V here, is the internal capsule showing the anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, and we can also appreciate retrolentiform part going towards the occipital cortex, visual cortex, forming the optic radiation, and sublentiform part going towards the temporal lobe, forming auditory radiation. And the white color things are the cavities of lateral ventricles, anterior horn and posterior horn of lateral ventricle. This is a MRI of a brain to show the infarction in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This is the normal side showing the anterior limb, posterior limb, and in between is the genu, and this light shaded area is the lentiform nucleus. And we can see here the infarct in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. As we know, the posterior limb consists of corticospinal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts and sensory tracts. So there will be the paralysis of opposite half of the body, including the sensory loss. I hope you all like my session. Please like, share, subscribe, and press the bell button for further notifications.